Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. My name is Sylvanna Falcón, and I'm an associate professor of Latin American and Latino Studies and the director of the Research Center for the Americas at UC Santa Cruz. The webinar this afternoon, Feminist Memories of Resistance in Latin America's Dirty Wars, is being sponsored by the RCA with support from UC Santa Cruz's Institute for Social Transformation and Special Events. Before we get fully underway, I want to acknowledge that the land where UC Santa Cruz sits is the unceded territory of the Waswas-speaking Yupi tribe. Today, the Alma Mutsun tribal band, which is comprised of the descendants of indigenous peoples taken to missions Santa Cruz and San Juan Bautista during Spanish colonization of the Central Coast, is working hard to restore traditional stewardship practices on these lands and heal from historical trauma. Land acknowledgement is important for recognizing the history of stolen lands and the presence of indigenous peoples and their enduring relationship to their traditional homelands. I would now like to share a couple of details about this afternoon's event. We are using a webinar tool, so there is no chat function. We will have an opportunity to answer your questions at the end of the presentation. And we invite you to submit your questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen at any time. You can access the closed captioning feature available on Zoom by clicking the CC box on your screen and selecting Show Subtitle. Please note that this event is being recorded. For the next 2 academic years, the RCA has adopted the thematic focus of mobilities and belonging. Our hope is to promote meaningful conversations at UC Santa Cruz and beyond that explore this theme alongside the crises that displace, move, and divide us in order to create new opportunities to rethink and reimagine our collective trajectories and futures, and to spark discussions of what brings and holds us together. We invite you to learn more about our theme and our upcoming events by clicking on the link in the chat. Now it's my great pleasure to virtually welcome you to this afternoon's conversation featuring Dr. Viviana MacManus, Assistant Professor in the Department of Spanish and French Studies at Occidental College. Dr. MacManus earned her PhD in literature from UC San Diego. Dr. MacManus's presentation will center on the history of gender and state violence during the so-called Dirty Wars of Argentina, 1960s through 1980s. And the current struggle over the historical memory of this era. Dr. MacManus proposes a Latin American feminist theory of justice through a close examination of narratives about loss, haunting, and trauma. In particular, her work challenges state projects and masculinist leftist movements that have largely erased the gendered violence of this era. Drawing on oral histories, human rights reports, literature, and film, today's talk will primarily draw from her book, Disruptive Archives, Feminist Memories of Resistance in Latin America's Dirty Wars, published by the University of Illinois Press in 2020. This book received an honorable mention for the Gloria E. Anzaldúa Book Award from the National Women's Studies Association, and was selected as a Choice Outstanding Academic Book Title in 2021 by the Association of College and Research Libraries. Once Dr. MacManus finishes her presentation, I will rejoin her in dialogue and to facilitate the audience Q&A. Thank you again for joining us this afternoon, and without further ado, let's welcome Dr. MacManus to UC Santa Cruz.
Thank you so much, Dr. Falcón, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you to all of you for coming here today, especially UC Santa Cruz's Research Center for the Americas, and the Special Events Office and the Institute for Social Transformation for hosting my talk today. I want to start by sharing my screen. So I wanted to begin my talk by going over a little bit about where my interest and how this book came to be in the first place. So really my interest in Latin American feminist archives stems from my own family's storytelling practices. And I have a couple of photos here. On the left is a photo of my grandfather as a child with his siblings in Cuba. And on the right is a picture of my great-grandmother and my grandmother at the top left with her siblings from Zacatecas, Mexico, rural part of the state. And my Mexican and Cuban family's history and the tradition of storytelling in my family, which illuminated histories of surviving poverty, gender discrimination, racism, classism, and most importantly for my work, histories of US imperialism in Latin America. These stories really shaped my personal and professional interests. So for example, my grandfather from Cuba would regale us with narratives of how he grew up in poverty-stricken Cuba before the revolution due to US intervention, and the US thought that Cuba was going to be a colony of the US. And he was always an outspoken critic of US imperialism and a supporter of the revolution. And so when I was younger, I thought, why is his story not more widely known? Whereas other Cuban immigrants in the US, that's the narrative that we hear, the Cuban immigrants that flee communism. And so similarly, my Mexican immigrant grandmother and great-grandmother from Zacatecas would always narrate to us the importance of community and solidarity to help uplift fellow immigrants in the Los Angeles area when they moved from Mexico. So these stories really inculcated me at a young age the importance of archiving histories from below and how storytelling can be a form of feminist resistance. So really my book is inspired by my family's feminist storytelling practices and turns to the memories articulated by women survivors of state violence in Latin America. And so at its core, Disruptive Archives centers on the power of storytelling that is found in disruptive archives of women who were involved in armed and unarmed movements during the so-called dirty wars of Mexico and Argentina. It turns to the memory projects of women survivors and the resistant efforts against the legacy of state trauma and violence. And so women's narratives of survival are what I term disruptive archives, and they serve as archival sources that contest hegemonic forms of knowledge on this era. These narratives challenge masculinist official histories and forms of knowledge, and as well as archival research in order to address the gendered erasure of dirty war historiography. So in the process of constructing these disruptive archives, women are able to transform dehumanizing violent memories of repression and trauma into historical memory projects that seek justice for crimes of the state. And so the book turns to different forms of women's storytelling through oral histories, testimonial literature, fiction, film, in order to examine how Mexico and Argentina's state terrorism was gendered and how the representations of this era minimize women's involvement in these revolutionary movements, both by the state in order to pursue neoliberal closure of moving beyond the violence of the past, as well as the leftist revolutionary collective memory that overlooks gender dynamics and the critical role women played in the movements in order to create a cohesive and linear account of the past. And so I was really intrigued by the hemispheric pattern in remembering and retelling and reframing women's histories of violence. So one element of the book highlights parallel forms of gendered and state violence in Southern Cone military dictatorships like Argentina, as well as authoritarian states like Mexico's Institutional Revolutionary Party, or the PRI, government during the 60s and 70s, as well as the gendered scripts that set forth a masculine authoritarian national identity. And it was really important to integrate Mexico into this transnational focus, because often in discussions of the dirty war and state violence, Mexico's supposed democracy is not included when we think about in these conversations of hemispheric state terror. So it was really important to center and illuminate the similar tactics of repression and state violence that the Mexican government instituted and normalized, compared alongside with more fascist regimes like Argentina. So I look at how the normalization of gendered and state violence in nominally democratic states like Mexico, as well as fascist regimes like Argentina, to examine and unearth these parallel forms of violence, as well as how these states perceived politically active women. And these women in both states were perceived as threats to national and social ideologies because they were going against the gender norms set forth by both authoritarian states. And so again, it's really important in the book to make these links between Argentina and Mexico, because there is less known about the Mexican dirty war, and it was more covert and secretive. And there exists such a large body of scholarship already on the Argentinian dictatorship, especially the feminist research of this era by path-breaking scholars like Diana Taylor and Barbara Sutton, just to name a few. And there is a growing body of work being done on Mexico's own dirty war, but it is lesser known. So it is to center and to debunk the myth that Mexico was a site of progress compared to the tumultuous Argentinian dictatorship. So that is another element of the book that I center on. So with this hemispheric perspective in mind, my book traces the genealogy of a transnational Latin American feminist memory in cultural productions and women's testimonies. So it considers how women's storytelling and cultural texts can offer alternative, radical possibilities for achieving gender justice for crimes of the state, and to rescript master narratives that set forth an active forgetting, or olvido in Spanish, of women's histories of resistance. So Disruptive Archives invokes knowledge from firsthand accounts, such as oral histories, documentary and testimonial literature, as well as literary imaginings, such as fiction and narrative film, and serve as disruptive archival sources to empirical findings on the dirty wars. But it's important to mention that my book is not solely preoccupied with recovering empirical data found in the women's narratives, or is it preoccupied with solely filling in the gaps of these masculinist historiographies? So my engagement with the texts and sources are not just I don't see them just as data, which is important. There's important data that they reveal, but really I center on this dialogic relationship, one that requires our presence, right? That it requires a shift in our thinking of who we are and how we relate to the world around us. And this is exactly what I argue these disruptive archives do, and how they lead to a Latin American feminist theory of justice. So since I was trained in literary and cultural studies, my approach to the book was interdisciplinary and resulted in a methodological blend of cultural studies, literary and film studies, oral history methodology, social movement historiography, and feminist theory. So incorporating all of these throughout the book was at times very challenging, but also quite rewarding. And so with this literary cultural studies training, my book considers how the content and the form of cultural texts and testimonies differ from these more mainstream hegemonic mass memory projects produced by the state and leftist groups, which thereby creates an alternative feminist epistemology on the dirty war era. So I use a Latin American feminist cultural studies lens to approach the tensions and contradictions of historical junctures, events, and social ideologies that characterize this period in Latin American history, particularly in how cultural producers and survivors represent these tensions and gaps. And as Latin American feminist scholar Jean Franco states, cruelty leaves long-lasting memory traces, hence the recurrent theme of buried books, faded photographs, fragmented testimonies, exhumed bodies, harvests of bones. And so this harvest appears in various literary forms, oral histories, embodied expressions, visual cultural texts that exhume buried memories of gendered state-sponsored violence. And my book engages deeply with these fragmented testimonies, these buried books, and other disruptive archival sources that yield a harvest of bones of Latin America's gender dirty wars. So I want to turn briefly to an example of how I engage with cultural texts in chapter 3, which is called Ghosts of Another Era, Gendered Haunting and the Legacy of Women's Armed Resistance. So here I examine film and literature that reveal what I call a gendered haunting that results from a disavowal of women's participation in guerrillas, as well as the eradication of women's histories of resistance from Mexico and Argentina's national consciousness. I look at Mexican director Luisa Riley's 2012 documentary film called Flor en Otomí, or Flower in Otomí, which centers on the life and death of Denny Prieto Stock, who's a 19-year-old member of the Mexican urban guerrilla group called the National Liberation Forces, or FLN. And she was ultimately murdered by the Mexican army in an ambush in 1974. I also pair this alongside Marta Diana's collection of testimonies about Argentinian women guerrillas, which is a compilation. Her book is a compilation of former guerrillas, testimonies, of former guerrillas, and also includes Diana's own reflections on her personal connection to the women. And the book is inspired by the life of Adriana Lesgart, the author's childhood friend, who joined the armed insurgency, the Montoneros, in Argentina, and was also murdered by the Argentinian army in 1979. And so these texts in this chapter center the silenced narratives and how the history of the guerrilleras, the women who take up of the armed insurgency, is erased in contemporary neoliberal Argentina and Mexico. So by not contending with the unresolved violence and gendered erasures from the past, I argue that this has led to a generation of specters whose history of revolutionary struggle continue to haunt contemporary Mexico and Argentina. And so in the film Flower en Otomí, the filmmaker Luisa Riley doesn't give us a historically chronological narrative, but she compresses this sort of temporal distance by moving between three narrative lines in the film. So the first narrative line offers us a biographical sketch of Denny Prieto Stock's life leading up to her involvement in the guerrilla. She uses testimonials, photographs, and personal letters to reveal the critical moments that really shaped Denny's political consciousness. The second storyline centers on her time in the guerrilla, the FLN, and relies on fellow guerrilleros' testimonies to relate their experiences. The third narrative takes place in the present day, and the film journeys back to the safe house in Nepantla in the state of Mexico, where the survivors recount the events that took place on the day of the ambush when the Mexican army attacked the house and killed several of the guerrilla members. So the film shifts from one time period to another and narrative frame to another, and it's constantly being pulled back to the third narrative, which is the site of the violent ambush. And we see this in one scene. There's a temporal compression where Laura, her American cousin, reads from a letter that Denis had sent her in 1970, 3 years before she went to live clandestinely with with the FLN, excuse me. And so here's a portion of the letter. She says, I've had a sort of hazy feeling as though I'm really sick inside. It's like a deep disappointment, but I'm too lazy to do anything about it. It's so hard to explain. Let me try and put my thoughts in order. First, I started thinking, why the hell am I studying if in the end, I'll probably leave everything and go to the mountains and fight guerrillas and probably get killed in the process. So as Laura, her American cousin, is reading aloud from the letter in the present day, 2011, when the film was made, the camera pans over Prieto Stock's original handwritten text where the phrases hazy feeling and sick inside are in the foreground of the scene. As Laura continues to read the letter out loud, the camera switches back to a black and white photo of a young Denis Prieto Stock, then switches back to the text of the letter as the camera draws our eyes to the words guerrilla and killed. And as her cousin Laura Stock finishes reading the letter, the next scenes cross-cut to the yard of the safe house where they were killed, where Denis was killed. And so by repeatedly cross-cutting to the scene of the ambush in the present day in Nepantla, the film invokes what I argue is what is unrepresentable, this violent repression of the armed insurgencies in 1970s Mexico, and the traumatic legacy of Denis Prieto Stock's death. And so her death is what scholar Avery Gordon calls a seething presence, and that this film evokes it by showing us that it cannot be represented. Yet the film is able to conjure the spectral qualities that her trauma and the trauma of this period represent. And this is clear in the blending of images of the photograph, the letter, and the yard of the safe house, which was the site of Denis Prieto Stock's death. The quiet stillness of the scenes of the Nepantla house is also contrasted against the final words of Prieto Stock's letter, which eerily foreshadow her own death. And here we also see close-up images of the home's exterior that still display bullet holes from the day of the attack. And so the scene of the ambush is always portrayed in the film as a tranquil sight, which also evokes a sense of haunting as the archival photos of the violent massacre of the guerrilla members in 1974 are positioned against the quiet scenes of the Nepantla house in 2012. And so this, I argue, this points to the unresolved legacies of violence and unearthed gendered histories of resistance related to Mexico's dirty war. So while my book deeply engages with radical feminist theories and knowledge produced or that we find in these cultural texts, it is truly the oral histories of women survivors that serve as my book's narrative arc. And one critical way that women resisted the legacy of state terror was to document, audio record their memories and testimonies. And so my Disruptive Archives really centers on the oral history of these women. And the project alludes to a radical possibility of oral history as a Latin American feminist methodological tool that can combat systems of power, legacies of oblivion, state-sanctioned impunity, and masculinist narratives. So between 2009 and 2014, I interviewed women of survivors of violence and also former members of armed and unarmed political groups in Mexico and Argentina. So 12 of these women's narratives are incorporated throughout the book. And the women I interviewed all situated themselves as agents of social change, and importantly, as active producers of knowledge on the gendered histories of the dirty war. The importance of these testimonies is also in that many of them have appeared in a lot of Spanish-speaking texts or testimonial collections, but I was I translated their text into English. So a lot of them were very eager to provide their narratives, and we're happy to have their stories disseminated in English as well. So I wanted to turn to an example of how we can get some feminist theory from these interviews. So in 2012, I interviewed Alejandra Pseudonym, who was a guerrilla of the People's Union. And I interviewed her in Guadalajara, Mexico in 2012. So toward the end of our interview, I asked Alejandra about her involvement in feminist movements in Guadalajara. And so I turned to this question because I wanted to explore the histories of women political militants in Mexico in the 70s and to learn more about how she positioned her feminist and revolutionary politics in relation to the legacy of the armed insurgencies in Mexico. And she answered the following. She said, I joined a feminist organization later after my participation in the guerrilla. First, what we had to do was fight against inequality, since there couldn't be democracy with inequality, even in the guerrilla groups. And wherever there was inequality, there could not be democracy. You want to democratize society, but you don't democratize your home. And then I realized that men and groups like the church, the governments, are bothered more by a feminist than a guerrillero who is armed. And so I think this response really articulates a complex theory of feminism that evinces the hierarchization that was found in both the state and leftist organizations at this time. And really, this is one example of many of how these women's testimonies serve as incisive, rich feminist theories as a critical example of Latin American feminist theories for justice. So to conclude, my book considers all of the things that are left unsaid and unrecorded. And for those of us who have approached official archives with trepidation, we know the importance of doing so. It is important for us to ask who creates the archive, who shapes how a country's history is officially documented and shared. And so the women's narratives unsettle linear, dominant dirty war era discourses and create new feminist knowledge that combats systems of power, oblivion, and impunity. And it's through the narratives of loss and haunting and trauma where a Latin American feminist theory of justice emerges, and one that positions these women as protagonists of this history and attests to their very presence, survival, and resistance. And as survivor Lelia Ferrarese explained to me in Rosario, Argentina in 2009, sigue siendo presente esto. This continues to be present. And as scholars and activists, we must tend to the haunting yet inspiring words of these histories of gendered resistance. Thank you for listening to my presentation, and I look forward to being in dialogue with Dr. Falcón.
Thank you so much, Dr. MacManus, for that really riveting conversation. I will say that feminist disruptions are my favorite kind of disruptions, and I really appreciated the richness of your book. I read it with great interest and it gave me a lot of food for thought. I thought in particular, the two really instrumental or innovative approaches to the book was both its methodological approach, right? The richness of the oral histories combined with the human rights reports and the literature and the film, and also in picking two sites that are often not compared. That to me was a really rich conversation that you had in the text. The questions you explore throughout, the silences, the trauma, the gaps, and the ghosts. The ghosts are everywhere, right, in your text. And all of that together is what's offering us, as you point out, this Latin American feminist theory of justice within a context of hemispheric state terror, right? By picking two locations from different parts of the hemisphere, you really delineate this hemispheric state terror. Your engagement with carcerality, I also thought was very rich, because it shows that carcerality is beyond the detention center itself. It's very important to understand that once someone is released from a detention center, that does not mean you are released from imprisonment, because the trauma is working in that particular space. The other part I thought was really rich about your book is your engagement with temporality, and you talked about it here in your presentation today. The part that I found most generative was thinking about the suspicions that emerge in that period from disappeared to reappearance. And that remembering that has happened during your oral history interview in particular is asking people to recount in a nonlinear way what happened to them and the memories that in fact may be suppressed and that now come out in the conversation with you. The gaps, right? The ghosts. I'm writing about how in Latin America, we tend to dance with the ghosts. The ghosts, the gaps, those silences, they seem to beg for some kind of coherence. And I think your work shows us that that is not necessarily possible all of the time. And at the same time, I think there's something so contemporary about your book referring to a historical period right now, as we see so many upheavals, gestures to authoritarianism, non-gestures to authoritarianism happening throughout the hemisphere. So I have a number of questions for us to start with our dialogue, and I would like to encourage, again, audience members to please put your questions in the Q&A box so that we can get those incorporated into our dialogue as well. So my first question is about the term feminist. And I think both of you and I have talked about this, and when we have written about this, that navigating the term feminist is one that one has to consider when doing research in Latin America. And that some of the women you interviewed, right, and some of the cultural texts and the films and things that you draw upon for your research didn't necessarily openly adopt a feminist identity. But you obviously, and with some clarity in the book, talk about why you use the term feminist in the book and also in the presentation. So could you talk, and I offer this especially for those who are graduate students doing research in Latin America, how you have to sometimes be creative in how you engage in some of these questions around feminism. But could you talk about the ways in which you explored these feminist questions that you were curious about without directly asking about feminism?
Thank you. Yeah, that's an excellent question. It was something that I thought about going in. I did my first kind of portion of research as a graduate student, and then later as a postdoc. But the first time I went, I expected the women I interviewed to define themselves as feminists, because the work they did, to me, and I think to many of us, we would call feminist work. But so many of them rejected that term, which I found really interesting. So I think, and this is where I turn a lot to your work, actually, Dr. Falcón and other colleagues who do work on feminisms in Latin America, that I think as scholars situated in the West, right, even though we may be women of color, we are still seen as Americans when we travel and do research in the global South or Latin America. So I think being very cautious of not to impose a kind of, like as you talk about in your work, sort of a global North Eurocentric notions of feminist activism and knowledge building, right? When we examine histories of repression and activism in Latin America, as well as the global South in general. And so I think as those of us engaged in transnational feminist work located in the global South, we have to be very attentive to positionality, as well as the kind of work that we're doing, and not to reinforce a kind of top-down theory of feminism comes from the global North, and we are imparting it into the global South, right? Which is a very sort of imperialist notion of Western feminism, right? And I think as women of color feminists that we work against that, but then even as women of color feminists in the global North as Americans, we are not, there's still a divide, right, with the women we are interviewing in the global South. So I think just being very cautious and mindful of those relationships and positionalities, and being very forthright, especially when working with interviews or oral history methodology. I think that is something as really helpful to keep in mind, especially as graduate students or even now. And I think I learned so much from the women I interviewed. I mean, they taught me, right? I think like I wasn't expecting to go in and teach them anything, but I think I was just so amazed at the kind of theory that emerged from their words and their testimonies, that I hope comes across in the book, right? That I hope that isn't like, I'm making this theory up, but this is what I learned through their words and their brilliance in terms of the kind of theories of justice, of human rights, of feminism, even though they would not call, some of them would reject that. And I actually have a quote that I will share with you all from one of the women I interviewed, who completely rejected the term feminist, right? Because I asked her if she defined herself as a feminist, what she thought of the term. And she said, I think that's a Western American term. And so I'll just share we can read along together. So this is her response when I asked her if she thought she was would consider herself a feminist. She said, I don't consider myself a feminist, but I do have a very special way of considering myself a woman, not a feminist, a very special way of thinking. The question of gender was not in place because it was not necessary to consider it an ideology of change in society, for equality, for friends, and of possibilities. So I think that for me, these words and oral histories can teach us about different perspectives of gender and feminism, because they do call into question the sort of Western, Eurocentric, imperialist notions of feminism. And so this is where or in my own interpretation, I view it as a sort of Latin American feminist theory of justice, right? That doesn't just focus on questions of gender, but anti-capitalism, and so it kind of invokes different theories of justice and equality. And so that was something that I thought was really fascinating, that I truly learned more from them about feminist theories and discourses. But what I also thought was interesting is that some of the women I interviewed didn't want to speak critically about the gender dynamics of the organizations they were a part of, because so many of the men were still disappeared or murdered by the state. So there was one woman I interviewed who said, I don't want to speak ill of my compañeros, right? Because they're still disappeared, and feminist terms don't work in this situation. So I think just being very respectful, and when writing and analyzing their testimonies, of course, we're always going to have our lens, right? But being just very careful to be authentic and true to what they said, and not label them as they're feminists, even if they deny it, right? Which I think is something to be very mindful of. But I think those are just a couple of examples that I think were really fascinating to me, right? The work that they do, I think we would consider feminist, but they don't embrace that term for very obvious reasons.
Yeah, I thought the part where you talked about, the feminists who didn't want to speak ill of the disappeared, I thought there was a way to think about that as they're just not willing to engage. They're just not willing to be forthright. But I think you wrote about it, or at least I read about it as the reader, that is really just about respect, and that you can feel for somebody who is of the disappeared and somebody who was your compañero, and not necessarily be in a place because of the time to make those sort of open critiques about perhaps some, sexist and patriarchal interactions. I want to pick up on the point about being US people doing research in Latin America, or I think this would apply to other parts of the world. I really thought it was very important that you talked about the unease and some of the awkwardness that came through in the interviews, with even one person teasing you that you must be from the CIA. And as you write your book, and as you shared in the presentation, you mentioned, right, that some of your family members, politically active, leftist members of your family, your Cuban grandfather in particular. Now, this is a hypothetical question, but I think it's a productive one for us to talk about. And I'm asking again for those of us who maybe don't have that family lineage that can provide a different level of perhaps legitimacy. How do you think about the navigation here? Because we do that to build trust that, yes, we can have this conversation. And I write about the teasing that I experienced as well. But how do you build trust if you don't have that family lineage, if you don't have that kind of, history to draw from?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because I didn't think about it. I just sort of, I remember just going to that, and they would be like, why are you here? What's your interest? And I would immediately jump into, well, my family isn't Argentinian, but my family experienced US interventionism. That's why they left to the US. And so that immediately softened the mood, mm-hmm. right? And that, what psychoanalysts and oral historian theorists talk about in the sort of moment of transfer, right? The connection between interviewer and interviewee, which is like a really critical moment, right? To establish that connection and to sort of open the doors for that. And so I just didn't even realize how fortunate I was to have that link, but it made sense as to why I chose the kind of work I'm doing and what really draws me to the kind of work I'm doing. And so it was a natural, easy connection. And even still, like, I think that joking about being from the CIA and being so critical of the US, particularly the one woman, Alejandra, who said, you're using a pseudonym, and if you publish in an American publication, don't use my real name. Your government is the cause for, all of our this horror. So, and rightly so. But I think, one of the things that I learned from my oral history training when I worked in Spain for the Spanish Civil War archive, we worked on an interview methodology that really sort of relied on an open format protocol, which allowed the people to speak freely and openly about their lived experiences. And I think especially for people working with survivors of trauma or state violence or any kind of issue, themes around that, I think the approach to the topic has to be done very carefully and with a lot of respect, and to center that person being interviewed, because I think sometimes what can happen is that person is treated as a research subject, that you just kind of go in, extract what you need data-wise, and then you leave. And so I think without a sort of entry point, like if I didn't have that entry point, I think that this is where I think psychoanalytic theory and methodology can be very useful. So Diana Taylor and Dory Lobb talk about, moments of transfer, banter, points of personal contact. Diana Taylor talks about this in her text, The Archive and the Repertoire, where she says the power of the repertoire, that knowledge that requires presence, right? So she says that, we have to have we participate in that knowledge production by being part of that relationship. So it's not it's not like it's a dialogic relationship. And I think being present and establishing oneself as what Dory Lobb calls an empathic listener, requiring that your presence, that this kind of presence is required in this kind of work, helps build a sense of trust with the folks that you are interviewing. I think especially for oral history methodology, that's a key part. So I think that psychoanalysis and that would really help with the kind of methodological approach to oral history methodology, particularly when it comes to topics around trauma or state violence or surviving violence. And I think also what really assisted was the people I interviewed also really wanted their narrative. Like many of them were used to giving testimonies and were really excited to participate. Even there was some skepticism about being an American. They were excited to participate and wanted more people to read their histories, right? They just said, they wanted these stories out there in any way possible. So I think a lot of them were very seasoned, testimony providers. And so that also helped. And it's having contacts and in the locations that you're, not just kind of going blindly and showing up at a human rights center, but having those connections and people that and so I had a lot of help and connections with people in Mexico and Argentina, opening those doors. So all of those elements kind of contribute to, would help if I didn't have that kind of family background that also open the doors.
Yeah, I think for myself, since I did not have that family background, it was really important to spend more time in the field, or in my case in Peru, longer than maybe I would have had I maybe had some of that family lineage, because I found for myself that once I got the buy-in from one person, it's quickly then led to the buy-in for the next person. But to build that trust took, 2, 3, 4 more times, right? It just takes a lot longer. I think
for you with skepticism, you said you also.
Say that again?
You said that you were also treated suspiciously.
Oh yeah, no, I was part of the CIA, or maybe I could have been. And I said, I assure you I'm not. And it became, in part of what I actually found to be instrumental in building the trust was to have an actual open conversation pre-interview, right? What do we make of the world? And just sort of opening that conversation about kind of a critical worldview, critiques around US empire, US intervention. And I think just having cafecito and having those conversations, going for walks, those things ultimately helped, because then you have the warmth, that you have the empathy, right? You've shared that to listen. And so there's a great question in the Q&A box that I think would be a good follow-up to this conversation about family. Cecilia asks, you began your talk discussing familial storytelling as an inspiration for your archival research. In other words, that your family's intersectional Latin American history allowed you to understand how personal narratives illuminates the past in essential ways. How has your work for this book project shed new light upon your understanding of your own family's history?
It's a really profound question. Thank you for that. Yeah, I think it has really heightened my awareness of more about the role of US imperialism and how it led to my family's migration patterns to the US, particularly with, not just the sort of like victims of US imperialism, like clearly with my grandfather, but that his father was an American, Scottish American investor who thought Cuba was going to be part of the US and benefited from that. So there's sort of elements of kind of like the ugly side of family history, what I think was also illuminated and makes such a fascinating revelation of the sort of feminist lens that we can apply when we think about histories of US imperialism and in Latin America, and how it sort of it also really for me reaffirmed the kind of the strength that especially the immigrant Mexican women in my family, the sort of difficulties they had faced, right, due to a lot of this sort of structural systemic issues that they had to overcome in rural Mexico, and how they sort of relied on a kind of feminist, they wouldn't call themselves feminists, of course, but a sort of feminist solidarity practice to survive when they immigrated to Los Angeles, right? So I think it makes me definitely more appreciative of the kind of difficulties that they endured, but also illuminates as well the kind of tensions and contradictions within my own family's history, right? That there are these kind of family members that benefited from US imperialism or were complicit in US economic imperialism in Latin America. And so there's that kind of like that interesting tension, right? That it's not like, oh, we were all sort of victimized by this, but that, oh, okay, we also have family members that were part of this, benefited from this history of US empire. And so kind of reckoning with that has also been an interesting moment, right? To think about, okay, well, how did we get to this point, and why, how did this, how did this lead to their migration into to US? So I think that for me, the kind of feminist theory that I learned from the book and the sort of theories that are illuminated in these women's narratives make me definitely more appreciative of the storytelling I heard growing up, but also makes me almost like want to go back and do maybe another project on family, presence and family history in Latin America.
Thank you so much. There's another question that I think is a good follow-up here too, about, thanking you for your work and your presentation. If you could talk about the repository, was there a repository where you consulted these oral histories, and asking more specifically about which archives you consulted for your research?
Repository. So I didn't turn to a specific, I would turn to testimonial collections. So for example, there's one I mentioned called Mujeres Guerrilleras by Marta Diana, who's an Argentine writer. Her book is sort of like a blend between testimonies of women guerrillas from the 1970s in Argentina, but also her personal reflections kind of weave throughout. I also consulted, and these are texts that are not super easy to find. So of course, that also adds another layer to the like archival process of, we have to actually travel to these places to buy these books. They're not easily accessible online or through Amazon, online purchasing. So there is a great repository in Argentina. I haven't gone to yet. Hopefully will, called Memoria Abierta, or Open Memory, which I think Dr. Barbara Sutton uses a lot. And I think in the case of Argentina, they're a bit more organized with that in the sort of post-dictatorship period of archiving testimony and the formation of memory sites, right? In Mexico, it's much more focused on, and not to say that the human rights organizations in Argentina were definitely behind a lot of these formations to get the state to, sponsor and open these memory sites. But in Mexico, it's definitely not the same. It's these repositories are more organized by survivors and human rights activists. So it's sort of like extra work that they do in the compiling of testimonies and of survivors of the dictatorship. So I really relied a lot on, in addition to the oral histories I conducted, I relied a lot on testimonial collections and different kinds of texts. Human rights reports too also compiled official testimonials from survivors. And there's one great text that I use a lot that was just sort of a self-published book by Mexican guerrillas. They had a conference in the early 2000s, and then they published, one of the guerrillas did a self-publication text of a compilation of the testimonies. And, those are the kinds of texts that are very hard to find, self-published, right? So there is a kind of interesting archival process that there are a lot of barriers, right, to find, especially in the case of Mexico, because there's less acknowledgement and less awareness of their own history of a dirty war. Whereas in Argentina and Chile, it's more organized, so it's, I think, a little bit easier to find and access these archives.
Absolutely. One of the questions in the Q&A box is about the film. If you could remind the audience about the name of the film. All I got was Floor, and where you could actually access that film. And then I think followed up to that, I'd be curious if you could talk through how did you go about deciding the films for the book?
Well, that's a great question. I becoming more and more interested in film. I absolutely love it. And I think teaching it too in my human rights classes and for undergraduates, it's an incredible way for them to engage with the kind of topics that we do, not to say that literature and other forms of text that they are so, but I think it's like an easy, almost not an easy, but it's a great entry point for students to get to talk about these themes, that the topics that we want them to. The film is called Flor en Otomi, or Flower in Otomi. I can put that in the chat I'm sure.
Yeah, you can see in the Q&A box.
Okay.
You can put it there, but go ahead and finish your answer, and then we can put it in the chat.
Okay.
Or put it in the Q&A.
Sure, no problem. And I believe you can find it online. We purchased it for our library access. I don't know how easy it is to find just for your own viewing pleasure. It's actually also, which also points to the kind of, again, when we're talking about Mexico, the difficulty of accessing some of these titles, even for educational purposes. I was actually able to meet the director and interview her when I was in Mexico City, and she just gave me a copy of it. So, but it is produced by Icarus Films. So I think that you could contact them. I don't believe it's Women Make Movies. It might be Women Make Movies too. They're a very famous site, but there's Icarus Films, and I think you can access it more easily than other films. But that kind of process of how do you get these films, sometimes you just go and contact the director. I contacted another director named Daniela Rea. I'm sure some of you heard of her. She's from Mexico. I was looking for one of her films that talks about disappearance from the dirty war and disappearance because of the narco state. And I wanted to watch it and maybe do it for my research. And I couldn't find it anywhere. My library couldn't find it. It's just like these films are so hard to locate, but I was able to contact her. I was like, let's just see, right? And with a little bit of research, I got her email from the distributor, and she was like, here's a copy online. I'm happy to share it. So it's fascinating to me how difficult some of these sources can be to find, right? It's so hard. And I think that also shows the sort of, especially when we think about Mexico, the sort of social amnesia when it comes to this type of these topics, especially the sort of recent history of their dirty war, and especially the sort of gender dynamic, the participation of women. So for these films, I think I was really fascinated with the difference between narrative film and documentary. So I incorporate both throughout the text. One chapter talks about a film called Garaje Olimpo, which is an Argentine film about the dictatorship and the concentration camps in Argentina. And that one was a little bit more, that's also not as easy to find. I'm kidding. I was gonna say, I think it's easier. No, it's not. It was also, there's a lot of controversy when it came out in Argentina in the 90s. And so it has to deal with the death flights in Argentina, where prisoners were drugged and then dropped over the Rio Plata in Argentina. And so these films, I feel like, sort of seeing the difference between narrative film and documentary film. How do we incorporate some of these sort of literary or cultural imaginings on these topics of trauma and violence versus documentary film, and is there much of a difference in how these kinds of films represent these histories of gender and violence in the Americas? So I think the films, there's so many amazing films on these topics, so it's actually hard for me to pick because I wanted to write about all of them. Especially now, I think there's a lot of amazing documentaries in Mexico about the disappearances today and the narco state, and there's some the ties to dirty war era violence.
Yes, thank you so much. And thank you to Heather, who put a YouTube link for the film, and you can see it there in the Q&A box. So I want to ask this question from Annie, who's one of our wonderful graduate students here at UC Santa Cruz, and who has a research project in Peru as well. So Annie says, thank you for sharing your work. I wanted to ask, recognizing that the women you interviewed may not necessarily see themselves as feminist, how do you create space or give space for these women as theorists capable of expanding on established feminist theories, or precisely pushing back against the gaps and silences within the theory itself? And you can see the question in the Q&A box if you need to look at it again, but really kind of expanding, if you will, your approach to this feminist theory of Latin American justice. You're on mute.
All right. Thank you. Yes, so I actually have an example. I think that one of the issues that came up was how to be mindful of the temporal gap between the time that they're narrating their experiences in the 70s and also the passage of time and what's happened between then and now that can shape or affect the way they narrate their memories, right? So some of the women I interviewed have had since become part of feminist organizations, or have kind of developed their feminist trajectory more. And that affected, right, the way they remember or retell their narratives from the past. I think that's kind of trying to get to the question. So to kind of give you an example, and I think this is where I'm saying that the theory that I'm gleaning from these women's words and texts gives us a new perspective, different way of thinking about feminist theorizing and organizing, especially when it comes to human rights. Because, and again, this is where I refer to your work, Dr. Falcón, when you talk about in New Directions and your colleagues in New Directions on Feminism and Human Rights, you talk about how human rights rhetoric can be employed as an organizing tool for women survivors of violence, but that when the state is in control of human rights processes, and it's also the same entity that committed those violations of human rights, that is where survivors are wary of that. And so the women I interviewed, the way they talk about this theorize this, right? Maybe they don't call it feminist theorizing, but we learn a feminist theory from their own words. And I think, so for example, in Argentina, the human rights courts did not acknowledge sexual violence as a separate cause from torture in general, and instead on focus on a universal subject of human rights. But then finally, the courts recognized rape as a separate crime committed by the dictatorship. And so they did that but they did it in a way that reaffirmed the state as a patriarchal garden of women's sexuality and honor. And so in my interview with Liliana Forchetti, she was a member of the Workers' Revolutionary Party in Argentina. She described how a certain law in Argentina, where rape was considered a crime against purity, but then eventually it was changed to crimes against sexual integrity. So she described how the effects of this patriarchal law had on cultural notions of women's honor and sexual propriety, even within the human rights legal community. And so she was preparing to give her testimony for the prosecution in a 2012 human rights trial, and a judge's legal aid asked her if she was a virgin when military officers raped her, and at the detention center she was held. And she describes her, I'll share the quotation with you because it's a really powerful one. Let's see. So she says that, this is her response. She said, I wanted to kill that woman. We are talking about the violation of basic human rights, and rape wasn't a question of honor. The penal code also heard us. Rape was a question of honor. It wasn't a question of basic human rights for women not to be raped. So I use this as an example as sort of like the theory that we can get right from that's a little bit more complex and profound than using sort of like a universal human rights lens, right? This is sort of absented from the universal human rights lens in Argentina, and she is giving her interpretation using a kind of feminist lens to talk about the sort of gender violence, the form of gender violence and patriarchal cultural norms were more focused on protecting women's purity and honor rather than the fact that rape is should be considered a violation of human rights, right? So, I think that this shows the sort of limits of a masculinist state-controlled human rights discourse, and her words and a lot of these women's words really kind of point us to the possibilities that we can get from their words and a new feminist theorizing from their words.
Thank you. Thank you for that response. I'd like to turn to a question posed by Rebecca Garcia. For some of us who identify as Chicanas, but not necessarily as feminists, what can we do to not be ghosted? And so if we want to go back a little bit to the ghosts, if you will. So for those who identify as Chicanas, but not necessarily as feminist, what are some of the things that can be done to not be ghosted?
So ghosted, I'm taking as to gain trust, right?
I'm sort of taking it as an erasure a little bit.
Oh, okay. Let's see. Let me see the question. I think I'm not quite sure I understand, like being erased as.
I mean, I'm reading it. I know Rebecca, so I'm just gonna, and Rebecca, feel free to elaborate if you want in the Q&A box, but I'm reading it as, Chicanas who maybe don't identify as feminist, who are also similarly perhaps in spaces in which their contributions are being erased. Their kind of political analysis is not being taken seriously. And so therefore their stories are also being erased in kind of larger political movements. Hopefully I got that right, Rebecca.
I think I see what you're saying. Yes. No, I think it's a very similar kind of context, right? Where we can see the sort of, if we talk to our grandmas, right? If I were to ask my grandmother if she would define herself as a feminist, she'd say, no, like I know, like on paper, to me, she was, right? So I think that that's a really interesting way of putting it, because I think being mindful of, again, not imposing our ideas of what we define as feminism, but maybe focusing more on the content and the work, right? That these women are doing, that maybe as academics we think, oh, this is feminist work. And I think especially for Chicanas, my family, my mom is Chicana. I also identify that way. There's such a strong history of, activism and political consciousness. And I think, even my own mother being part of the original Chicano movement in the 60s in UCLA. I think that also, I don't know. It's hard to kind of answer, I think, because it is a little bit different when we're talking about forms of discrimination in the US versus Latin America. But I do think there is overlap, right? In the way that sort of being wary of certain terms, Chicanas being maybe wary of feminism as sort of a white woman's issue, even though we know that ideally and like in theory, feminism is and should be for, right, the emancipation of all and eradicating inequalities and eradicating white supremacy and patriarchy and capitalism and all of that, right? So I think that's where I see the links between the kind of the way to be mindful of feminist as sort of like this Western white woman's term, but that feminism is and has always been a movement and a term for Chicanas Latinas, right?
Thank you. There's another great question in the Q&A box around how the study of trauma. So how do you, quote unquote, keep your head up? How do you proceed in a way that's productive when you are studying trauma-filled pasts and trauma-filled presence. And also wants to thank you for your work. So if you could talk through a little bit about how you continue with the work.
Yeah, that's a great question. My family is like, why? And I say, I want to work more on narco, or, other violence. And so they're like, oh, more violence. So, it's just something, it is a good question because it can be very hard, especially after interviews, right? If for folks or other, grad students or colleagues that work on similar issues around trauma and violence, after a day of interviews, it can be so heavy, right? And I think I remember parts of my interviews in Spain and Latin America where you'd have this intense interview and then you go and you're talking to locals. And I remember talking to a local in Argentina and saying that, oh, well, those people did something, por algo será. There's a phrase, right? Well, those people did something to deserve it, which highlights the theory of the two devils, which is the state and the guerrillas and the leftists were equally to blame for the violence, that sort of erases the imbalance of power, right? But that narrative was so deeply entrenched in hemispherically, right? That, well, they did something to deserve it. And coming out of that, so that was really hard, right? To deal with the sort of the way that these narratives affected the social national consciousness of these nations, but also dealing with just having heard these very intense, harrowing testimonies, and then you have people completely denying that. And so I think for me, what really kept me going was coming back to the interviews, and even just sort of like on a very selfish way of book writing is not easy, right? You know how it can be very tedious and hard and frustrating and takes forever and many years. And there's just times where you're like, I don't know if I can do it. But I think really what inspired me so much were these women's testimonies, right? Like I just would come back to, and some of the cultural texts, right? Like the films, like Florenotomy, it just left me with such a sense of like haunting, but the way that haunting can be used to mobilize for justice, right? And so the women were so, not to completely romanticize them, but they were such, fierce activists, right? That despite everything they went through, they're still, in their 70s going to human rights groups and still marching in the streets and still protesting X, Y, and Z, right? And it's just those like their stories and what they continue to do despite everything was what kept me going, right? So I think of the words as like, the trauma and the violence of the words as harrowing, but also I turn to the kind of their theories around justice and human rights that I see, and their theories of resistance that I see as ways of just being empowering, right? And being inspired by them.
I was just going to say it's ultimately very inspirational, right? To see the kind of continuance of the work. So thank you so much for that question. There's another great question here in the Q&A box talking about kind of navigating safety issues as you conduct research in other places. So how did you think about your own kind of safety, your own kind of taking up particular spaces when you were traveling in Mexico and Argentina specifically?
Yeah, I think that's a good practical question, especially for folks who are interested in field work in places maybe they're not familiar with. Let's see, for Argentina, when I went last time, it wasn't super risky in terms of traveling alone. I was also fortunate to have my partner come along with me just because he wanted to also enjoy right, the research to accompany in my travels. I think that if you're doing more of a solo work, it's always important to have the contacts there. So I made sure to set up all my connections through, whether it was through friends or through the human rights organizations that I was connected with through friends and colleagues, always having folks there and just, kind of just being a savvy traveler. I mean, folks, like not taking, just sort of kind of a common sense approach to traveling, especially by yourself. But I think if you're not familiar with the place and if it's a sort of a dangerous region, right? There's parts of Mexico that I probably wouldn't go to, and I think a lot of people wouldn't go to. But I think like Mexico City, Buenos Aires, the bigger capitals, right? There's always some risk involved, right, with city and crime. But I was never concerned for my safety. I think folks that do more work in like journalism, right, especially in Mexico, that is a serious issue. Threat, more threat, right? They're being murdered all the time. So that's a very risky in the type of work that they're doing. But I think, there's always that element of like, okay, it might be, is it safe? But I think also coming back to the film, what's really interesting is that some of these topics there's still kind of an issue around talking about them, or safety issue. So in the film, if you watch it, they don't have any names for the people giving their interviews, and it's interesting because there is a safety issue for these people that are, they don't want to be identified. They just want to talk about, give their testimony but not be identifiable. So that's very interesting to see the kind of legacy of this era of violence, and how there's still possibilities for being attacked or targeted for speaking out against a past violence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's such a great answer, because I think it depends on the project. Like, I think there are certain places I did not go because when I was doing some research, it was just me and my child, and so you make different decisions based on the kind of situation and context and how much networks you have in the country that you are in fact in. But it's a good question, and I think one that merits kind of a lengthier conversation with particularly women researchers to just think about the different layers of security that maybe we have to think about.
Yeah, and I think also just to add in, like, I realized that I had the privilege of like blending in, right?
Yeah.
I didn't stand out. I could be Argentine. It wasn't. And I think for other, maybe researcher women of color, or like that can also add to a sort of, oh, okay, this person may not be from here, right? So that can add an element of safety concerns to just be mindful of. Yeah.
Exactly. There's a great question here about your next project. And I know we had talked a little bit about, and you gestured towards it in the book, around activist mothers. If you could talk a little bit about what's in the pipeline for you for your next research project.
Yeah, that's a great question. Yes, I think there was one element of my book where I talk about guerrilla mothers, and is a really fascinating part of this book that Marta Diana wrote, where she has an argument with a friend who was in a guerrilla because they disagreed on whether a woman who left her child in the care of friends to join the guerrilla, if she did the right thing, right? So the question of, can women be mothers and be like armed insurgents, right? So it's a really fascinating to me. So I was like, okay, I think I need to come back to this, because there's some short films and literature in Mexico, as well as El Salvador, Central America, where the trope of the guerrilla mother is seen as either a kind of romanticized, idealized, self-sacrificing for the revolution, where even her children have to be left behind, or by the state as like the worst kind of mother, right? Who abandons their mother. And there's no sort of like nuance between that. And I think it's super fascinating like storyline to me. And I think that kind of led me to look at the role, and it has nothing to do with the fact that I just became a mother 2 years ago, which I think maybe I don't know. I always thought that was interesting. But the role of the different forms of mother activism, which are considered more respectable, like the Madres of Plaza de Mayo, how you mobilize maternity for certain political gains, but that the guerrilla mother is kind of in contrast to that madre of the Plaza de Mayo, right? That's a bad mother activist versus good mother activist. So I'm becoming more intrigued to see how the trope of this kind of insurgent motherhood is kind of evoked in different kinds of cultural forms, in different human rights movements in Mexico, and the search for mother-led organizations that search for the remains of their disappeared loved ones. And also in different horror film and Gothic literature, which is becoming really kind of very popular now in Mexico and South America, as a use of the horror film to illuminate histories of gender and state-sponsored violence, and the figure of the mother as kind of central to teasing out those complications. So that's kind of where I'm heading for the next project. And so I'm really excited to kind of follow that route and kind of delve into horror genre, which is a new area for me.
That should be exciting. I think we're all going to be looking forward to that next project. I just wanted to ask as a final question, if you could talk about the book cover. I really loved it, and I thought it was really, a beautiful book cover. I wondered if you could share with us who the artist is, why you chose that book cover, as sort of a final wrap-up question.
Hey, thank you. Yeah. When I went to Mexico City, and I worked with the human rights organization there that is comprised of mostly former student activists from the 60s, and also young folks that are interested in historical memory. And some of my friends there, I'm still very close to there, and I'm very lucky. They would just give me all these books, and they're just so amazing. I'm just like, how do we, there's just like treasure troves of books. And one of the books they gave me was a collection of art by this American artist named Irene Templeton. I can put that in the chat. And I don't think I have it here, but you can Google her, and she was an American artist who traveled and spent a lot of time in Latin America. And she made this kind of, I forget the term for it, it's kind of easily reproduced sketches, right, that you can use for banners and flyers and political marches. And so she was very involved in different movements in all across Latin America and Mexico and Central America. And her story is actually really interesting because she was found deceased in, I think, Mexico, I could be wrong, in the 80s. So there's a sort of suspicious element around the nature of her death, but that's where the book cover art comes from, is that the picture of the three women's faces was actually, I think, used for one of the international women's conferences, I believe, in the 70s. And so I think I just really loved that image, and we were able to work with the artists at University of Illinois Press to kind of refashion it into that. And so I think it just kind of, I loved how it ended up. I was really excited about that, right? So I wanted like a very arresting, cool image to kind of represent the theme of the book.
Yeah, it's a beautiful image, and book covers to me are so fascinating because we give a lot of thought as to what goes in there, and you can see there in the chat.
Thank you. Yeah, perfect.
So thank you so much. Well, thank you, Dr. MacManus, for this really riveting conversation. It was delightful to read your work and to be in conversation with you. I'd like to thank everybody for joining us for this afternoon's webinar event in the Mobilities and Belonging series. I hope you can join us for our next webinar event, which is on Tuesday, March 29th at 12 noon. And the link is in the chat if you would like more information. So thanks again for everyone for being here. Thank you again, Dr. MacManus, for a wonderful conversation. And I hope everyone has a beautiful afternoon.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.